cancer. That's not a plan. It makes no sense. But see, that's the problem. I was trying to think it through analytically. Big mistake. Doesn't make any sense politically, but it doesn't have to make any sense on that level. It's actually quite genius, though, on an ideological propaganda level, right? Because what has he just said? He just basically looked at millions of white folks and said, they're coming for your money. When they get it, they're going to give it to those people. You see? That's genius. Intellectually, it makes no sense. Politically and propagandistically, it is a stroke of brilliance. You see? So they're going to play that game even though the president doesn't talk about race. The healthcare bill didn't say a thing about racism in the healthcare delivery system, and even then the right is going to beat him and anyone who supports even the mildest of reforms over the head with that stuff. You see? So at some point we either have to fight back or get used to the fact that they're going to use race against even the mildest of change while we remain silent, hoping that the subject will go away. But it shall not go away, because they will continue to exploit it even more. For us not to talk about it squanders perhaps the best opportunity that we've had as leftists, as progressives, as radicals, whatever term you choose, to build solidarity across racial lines. We haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that in a very long time. This is one of those moments, but only if we are brave enough to call it out like it is. You see, here's the thing. A lot of times, particularly those of us who are white, we think that this issue is really a black or brown issue, that racism is a black or brown problem. And maybe we are altruistic enough to become involved in it, you know. We don't really see it as connected to our daily life, but we better start realizing how much it is. Because to be perfectly honest with you, if you think about this economic meltdown for a second, think about the global economic crisis has been triggered mostly by what? The housing meltdown. Now ask yourself, think about the housing crisis, and the thumbnail, what is it? It was about banks and independent mortgage brokers and bank subsidiaries going into low-income neighborhoods, especially, but not only of color, but especially of color, and ripping folks off, basically giving them loan instruments that they knew full well they couldn't afford, but lying to them in many cases, and saying, oh, don't worry, you know, it's not going to balloon, the interest rate's not going to balloon for like 3 years, and we'll refi you by then, everything will be fine. Folks wanting a piece of that American dream that they've been told they're not real Americans without said, okay, and they signed on the dotted line. Now, the first time that I heard anything about this, what is called predatory lending, folks getting loans at much higher interest than what they would have received with their credit scores had they been white, had they been middle class, etc., or living in suburbs. First time I read about that was 1993. This isn't new. I'm talking 18 years ago. Read a book about it, and it was talking about how these lenders, sometimes banks, other times their subsidiaries, and then increasingly these independent mortgage brokers that are almost entirely unregulated by the state. The banks are regulated. The independent mortgage brokers, not so much. They were going in and ripping folks off. And at that time, it was almost all in black and brown space. And I remember there was just no traction on this issue. You couldn't get anybody to talk about it. Congress people didn't really want to. Actually, the Congressional Black Caucus did. They're about the only ones. But no national leader in any of either of the two main political parties wanted to touch it, really. The media didn't want to talk about it. I remember bringing it up to people, and they would say, well, you know, it's awful, but it doesn't really affect me, you know. Or even worse, they would say what you sometimes hear now, which is, you know what, if they're so stupid that they're not going to read the fine print on that loan document, then they deserve to lose their house. I paid my mortgage on time. They should too. Now, putting aside the ethicality of that indifference, one can make an argument it's pretty callous, but putting that aside for a second, that's a philosophical discussion we haven't got time for tonight. Ask yourself about the practicality of that indifference almost 2 decades later. Because see, it's one thing to act like it doesn't matter when there's only 1 or 2 houses in your census tracts that have gone into foreclosure. Oh, you can afford to rock that self-righteous attitude about how you pay your mortgage on time and you never ask for a bailout, and how dare these other people do that. You can do that, you see, when you are looking only at maybe 1 or 2 houses in your whole community that are in foreclosure. But when half the houses in your community are in foreclosure, because all of a sudden you've waited around a decade or 15 years or whatever it might be, and all of a sudden half the houses in your community are in foreclosure, in default. Now try to sell your house, you know. Good luck trying to sell your home. You're not going to be able to sell your own house any longer because your own property values will have declined, because you sat around and didn't care when other folks were suffering, you see. So in some regard, that indifference, which we thought wasn't affecting us, eventually does come back to haunt us. What are the two of the hardest hit communities in this country right now for mortgage foreclosures? Nassau County, Suffolk County. Look it up. Long Island, those are mostly white, overwhelmingly middle-class spaces, and they are suffering now because what the banks did and what the lenders did was they realized by the late 90s, early 2000s, the government was not going to stop them. They're not going to regulate us. We've been jacking these folks around in the hood. Why stop in the hood, man? Let's go to the suburbs. Let's go to the exurbs. You know what the exurbs are, right? Exurbs are this new geographic space that some folk carved out when the suburbs got too brown. We ran to the suburbs to get away from them, and some of them came with us. They like Olive Garden too. Didn't think they would do that. Now we got to carve out a new rim, call it the exurbs, and the bank said, cool, we'll go out there. And so now you got millions of white folks losing their stuff too. Millions of white folks facing that same kind of insecure future precisely because we didn't think this was a big enough problem. Just like that double-digit unemployment 10 and 15 and 20 years ago when only folks suffering were brown and black. You see? So at some point, you better start to care, not out of some charitable impulse or altruistic impulse, but because this is the opportunity to build solidarity, to realize that that racial inequity that plagues us affects all working people, affects the entire economy on which all of us depend, affects the culture upon which all of us depend. But if we're not willing to call out the racism that's inherent to that anti-government discussion about not intervening in the housing markets and not intervening to create jobs and not intervening in a healthcare crisis, if we don't call out what that's about, we can't ever make these connections. You see, we can't connect those dots, and we're weaker for it. But it's not just that. I want you to understand that it's not just a systemic issue. It is that, and as a leftist, I sort of start and end with this sort of systemic institutional analysis. But one thing that I've learned, I don't know if I knew it before I was a dad, I certainly know it now, is that although it is systemic, and although it is institutional, and although it is structural, it's also deeply personal what those structures do to you, what those institutions do to all of us. And although I might have had a glimpse of it before I became a father, it never became clear to me that it was a few years back. We were sitting around on a Sunday afternoon, my wife and my two daughters and I, and they were almost 6 and almost 4. It was a Sunday afternoon, early summer, school's out, raining outside, can't go out to the park, can't do anything fun outdoors. So we're trying to find something to do inside. We played every game in the house already. Kids are bored, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We're trying to find something to do, So we turn on the cable satellite thing, on demand, whatever it is, $4.95, get a movie, trying to find some movie that might be good for kids. Turning around trailers, commercials, looking to see something. We didn't find much, but we did come across the trailer for the movie Evan Almighty, which some of you might have seen. It's a cute film, fun. Steve Carell, right, plays a senator or congressperson who is told by God, who is played by Morgan Freeman, that a flood is coming and he should probably build a very large boat, one might say an ark, and ride it out. You've probably heard this story before in a different context. It's a modern retelling of the Noah and the Ark story. It's a funny movie, but as it turned out, my children and my wife had seen it. They'd gone to see it a few months earlier when it had been at the theaters. They weren't really interested in watching it again, but because the children recognized at least some of the dialogue and they recognized in the trailer, in the commercial, they recognized the actors, They looked up, it got their attention. The little one, Rachel, who's not quite 4 years old, looks up, sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God in the flowing white robes or whatever it was. She looks at me and she says exactly what a 4-year-old would say, which is, Daddy, is that really God? Right? Because that is what you'd say at 4. Like at 4, you don't know about the Screen Actors Guild. You don't know anything about casting directors. You just figured God wanted to make a movie. And if God wanted to make a movie, done. Doesn't take long to shoot. It's God. So she looked at me and asked me if that was God. I thought it was sort of funny. I chuckled. I said, no. That's not God. That's an actor. His name is Morgan Freeman. He plays God often. You will probably see him in this role again. But he's just a performer and he's just playing a role. And I thought that was the end of the conversation. But then the older of the two girls, Ashton, who was roughly 6, now she's caught wind of our conversation. She's interested. She's intrigued. She looks up. She sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God in the flowing white robes on the screen. She looks at her sister. And she laughs. And she says, Rachel, that can't be God. And I knew two things. And I knew them as surely as I knew my name. Number one, I was going to have to ask her why not. And number two, I already knew what her answer was going to be before I asked the question, but I had to ask it. Now, I was hoping for some support from my wife, who was sitting over in this general vicinity. So I looked her way, looking for some words of wisdom, some insight, some brilliance that would get me out of this jam. I got nothing. Except a look that roughly said, well, this would be your area of expertise. So good luck. I'm going to go get a camera. I'm going to take pictures. I might even scrapbook this precious moment. But I got nothing for you. I realized I was on my own, so I turned back to my child and asked her why. Why couldn't that be God? And she looked at me, and now, before she gave me her answer, I did have this fantasy for like this half a second or so before she gave me the answer that I fully anticipated. It was a fantasy that she was going to come up with some really brilliant alternative to what I anticipated. Like, oh, Dad, that can't be God because God's a woman. Or, that would be cool. Or even better, I really was hoping for like some existentialist answer like, Father, what is God? Really, Father, why must we speak of these things? That would have been really cool. But and she's smart, but no, that's not. So she wasn't going to come up with that. And instead, her mouth begins to move the words form, and I hear coming from her throat the very phrase that I knew I would hear, which is, that can't be God. And she said this with no sense of irony or misgiving. Can't be God because God isn't black, God is white. Now, I don't think it will shock any of you to learn that in my home, in our home as a family, there are no racialized images of a deity anywhere. There are actually no images of a deity, but if there were, they would not be racialized, right? We don't have any of those awful, venal, I might even say evil Bible children's storybooks. Evil because of the symbolism and the imagery and the iconography, like the images that would give you the impression that you didn't know any better that Adam and Eve had resided in the Garden of Sweden. We do not have any of that in our home. And yet, my child is picking up these ideas somewhere, not in our home, but somewhere, whether it's in a church or whether it's at a friend's house or a library, a bookstore, or on those Christmas cards we receive every holiday season, as I'm sure many of you do, which picture Jesus so white, so Europeanized that he might as well have been born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The reason I'm telling you this story is very simple. If you were to try to break into my house and poison my children, I would kill you. And I'm not saying it because I'm old, big, and bad. I'm like 5'8" on a good day, so I'm not a violent person, but I will defend my family if you try to hurt them. And yet the thing is, something is coming into my house, and it is poisoning my children, and the doors are locked, and the windows are shut, the alarm is on, and this thing that is coming in does not know the code to turn off the alarm, and it gets in, and it gets out as quickly as it came before either myself or my wife even knew it was there, and I resent it, and I resent it deeply. Because what it says is that no matter how much we try to inoculate ourselves or our children, our loved ones, our friends, our colleagues from this poison, it will get you. And as long as that can happen in my home, in a home where we talk about these things regularly and we deconstruct this issue on a regular basis, not using with small children the term deconstruction, but you know what I mean. If it can happen there, it can happen in any of our homes. It can take us away from who we were meant to be, either by God, however you conceive of that, or by nature, or perhaps both. My daughter was not meant to be that, but she will be that unless and until we do the work, you see. And if that's the message that it sends to little white children, that they're closer to the creative force of the universe, again, however you conceive of that, then what does it say to black children? What does it say to brown children? What does it say to children of color? It says that they are farther from that same creative energy of the universe. Again, however conceived, it is deadly. It is a soul wound, far deeper than that which we can possibly imagine.